People argue about who won Afghanistan. That argument only works if you never walk the ground. On the ground, there were no clear victories. There was dust, fear, waiting, and men watching each other without knowing who would move first. It's 2010, southern Afghanistan. Helmand Province. A U.S. patrol moves through a village that looks normal. Shops open. Kids nearby. No weapons. No fighters. And yet every soldier knows the truth. The Taliban could be 10 meters away or 10 seconds away. They didn't wear uniforms. They didn't stand and fight like an army. They blended in, disappeared, and came back when you weren't looking. The U.S. Army had technology the Taliban couldn't dream of. Air support, night vision, drones. The Taliban had time and patience. What really happened between the Taliban and the U.S. Army wasn't a single battle. It was a daily contest of control, fear, and endurance. Some days the U.S. Army dominated the ground. Other days, the Taliban owned the night. And sometimes, both sides walked the same road, pretending not to see each other. This isn't the war from press conferences. This is what actually happened on the ground. The first thing people get wrong is timing. When Americans talk about the Taliban, they usually start in the middle. But on the ground, this war started long before most U.S. soldiers ever arrived. By October 2001, the Taliban were already a government. They controlled Kabul. They controlled the courts. They controlled the roads, especially at night. When the U.S. Army first entered Afghanistan after October 7, 2001, the Taliban didn't meet them like a normal army would, because they weren't planning to win that way. In late 2001, U.S. Special Forces, CIA teams, and Afghan Northern Alliance fighters moved quickly. Cities fell fast. Kabul fell in November. Kandahar followed in December. From the outside, it looked like the Taliban were defeated. On the ground, something else was happening. Taliban fighters didn't die in place. They didn't surrender en masse. They left. They crossed into rural Helmand, Uruzgan, Zabul, and across the Pakistan border. Weapons were hidden. Fighters went home. Some shaved their beards. Some became farmers again. The U.S. Army thought the war had shifted into stabilization. The Taliban thought the war had only paused. Between 2002 and 2004, U.S. forces focused on hunting remnants of al-Qaeda and preventing Taliban regrouping. Patrols were light. Bases were small. Many areas were visited, not held. In places like Sanjin, Musa Qala, and Garmsur, U.S. troops would arrive, conduct patrols, talk to elders, then leave. The Taliban waited until they were gone. They didn't challenge U.S. firepower. They studied it. They learned how patrols moved, which roads were used repeatedly, which times soldiers felt safe. By 2005, the Taliban had adjusted. The Taliban avoided direct fights unless they had an advantage. They used small arms fire from long distances, hit-and-run attacks, IEDs placed days or weeks in advance. IEDs weren't random. They were placed where soldiers felt routine, near culverts, at road bends, outside villages where patrols slowed down. A patrol might walk the same road 10 times without incident. Then the 11th time, it would explode. That unpredictability broke something deeper than armor. By 2006 to 2007, U.S. Army and Marine units rotating through Helmand and Kandahar began to understand the pattern. The Taliban weren't trying to defeat them militarily. They were trying to exhaust them. Every patrol became a test of patience. Every village became a question. Was the quiet normal? Or was it staged? U.S. soldiers stopped trusting first impressions. They learned to watch hands, not faces. To read behavior, not words. The ground became an enemy of its own. Here's where the war truly split. The U.S. Army focused on presence, being seen, patrolling, engaging with locals. The Taliban focused on control, who people feared when soldiers weren't around. In places like Sanjin, U.S. patrols dominated daylight. At night, the Taliban returned. They enforced rules quietly. They punished collaborators. They reminded villages who would still be there tomorrow. This wasn't a battle for land. It was a battle for belief. By 2009, the reality was clear. When U.S. commanders reviewed the situation in 2009, one truth stood out. The Taliban had survived because they never fought the war the U.S. wanted them to fight. They adapted faster than expected. They accepted losses. They waited. And they were still there. That realization set the stage for the next phase of the war. Not bigger bombs, but a different approach. By late 2009, the U.S. Army stopped pretending the war was under control. It wasn't. Taliban attacks were increasing. IEDs were killing more soldiers than gunfire. Districts that were cleared on maps were slipping back the moment patrols thinned out. So the strategy changed. Again, in December 2009, President Obama announced a troop surge. By mid-2010, tens of thousands of additional U.S. troops arrived in Afghanistan. For soldiers on the ground, the change was immediate. More boots, more patrols, more contact. Places like Sanjin, Marja, Nat Ali, and Arghandab Valley became pressure points. These weren't symbolic locations. They were Taliban arteries, used for movement, weapons, and influence. This time, U.S. units didn't just pass through. They stayed. Sanjin wasn't famous on the news. Among soldiers, it was infamous. British forces had fought there before. By 2010, U.S. Marines took over. The ground was saturated with IEDs. Every step felt rehearsed by someone else. Patrols moved inches at a time. Metal detectors first. Eyes on the ground. Rifles up. The Taliban didn't rush attacks. They waited for patterns. When Marines set up patrol bases, the Taliban probed them at night. Sniper shots. Harassing fire. Small explosions meant to disrupt sleep. The goal wasn't to kill everyone. It was to wear them down. In February 2010, Operation Moshtarak began in Marja. This was supposed to be different. Instead of sneaking in, coalition forces announced the operation ahead of time. The idea was to show permanence. U.S. Marines advanced block by block. Taliban fighters melted away at first. Then they came back, through IEDs, ambushes, and intimidation. Clearing Marja took weeks. Holding it took years. Every school reopened required protection. Every local official needed guarding. Every road needed daily checking. The Taliban didn't challenge U.S. troops head-on. They challenged the idea that security could last. By 2010 to 2011, contact was frequent. But it rarely looked like traditional battles. A patrol would take fire from a tree line, then a rooftop, then nothing. Taliban fighters fired and disappeared before air support arrived. U.S. soldiers responded with discipline, bounding movements, overwatch, precision fire. Technology helped, but it didn't solve everything. You still had to walk the road. You still had to knock on doors. You still had to trust someone whose cousin might be Taliban. Afghan National Army units fought alongside U.S. troops daily. Some were brave beyond words. Others were inexperienced. Many were tired. They weren't rotating home in 9 months. This was their country. In places like Kandahar City, joint patrols showed progress. Taliban attacks dropped briefly. Markets reopened. Life looked almost normal. But outside the city, in villages, control shifted by the hour. Losses mounted. Not always in big battles. One step too far off the road. One wire missed. One moment of routine. Medics worked under fire. Medevac helicopters landed in hot zones. Names were removed from patrol rosters. There were no speeches. Just quieter patrols the next day. Militarily, the U.S. Army was winning engagements. Just quieter patrols the next day. Militarily, the U.S. Army was winning engagements. Taliban fighters were being killed or pushed out of key areas. Their freedom of movement was reduced. Networks were disrupted. But something else was happening. The Taliban were adapting again. They fought less. They waited more. And they watched the calendar. Because they knew something the soldiers on the ground were starting to feel too. The U.S. wouldn't stay forever. By 2012, the war stopped feeling urgent to people far away. On the ground, it still felt the same. Dust didn't care about timelines. IEDs didn't follow withdrawal schedules. Fear didn't leave just because a base closed. But something had shifted. U.S. units started packing up positions in Helmand, Uruzgan, and parts of Kandahar. Patrol bases that once held dozens of soldiers were handed over to Afghan forces or dismantled completely. This wasn't a retreat, but it wasn't a push forward either. Patrols became shorter. Air support required higher approval. Risk tolerance changed. Taliban fighters noticed immediately. They didn't attack the big bases anymore. They watched the roads. By 2013 to 2014, the Taliban stopped trying to win battles. They focused on winning absence. If U.S. patrols stopped coming to a village, the Taliban came back quietly. No flags, no gunfire, just presence. They reopened shadow courts. They collected taxes. They settled disputes faster than the government ever could. Not fair, not kind, but predictable. Villages didn't choose the Taliban because they loved them. They chose them because they were still there at night. From 2014 onward, Afghan National Army and police units took the lead. Some fought like professionals. Others struggled with logistics, leadership, and morale. They weren't lacking courage. They were lacking certainty. When supplies didn't arrive, trust eroded. When air support didn't come, confidence broke. When units rotated but the Taliban didn't, exhaustion set in. Still, they fought. In Lashkar Gah, Ghazni, Farah, Afghan soldiers held ground far longer than most people realize. But holding isn't winning. The Taliban didn't surge forward with columns of fighters. They negotiated. They waited. They made deals village by village. By 2019, many districts existed in a gray zone. Afghan flags by day, Taliban control by night. When the final withdrawal agreement was signed in 2020, the war's outcome didn't change overnight. It simply stopped being delayed. When cities fell in August 2021, it shocked the world. For people who knew the ground, it hurt, but it didn't surprise. Units that had fought for years without support finally stopped. Officials fled. Command chains broke. The Taliban walked into cities not because they were unstoppable, but because no one was left to stop them. The U.S. Army didn't lose battles to the Taliban. It won most of them. What it couldn't defeat was time, politics, and local fear. The Taliban survived because they adapted faster than systems could, because they accepted losses, because they didn't leave. On the ground, wars like this don't end with victory parades. They end when one side goes home. Taliban versus U.S. Army wasn't a simple fight. It was technology versus patience, firepower versus familiarity, presence versus permanence. And permanence won, not because it was better, but because it stayed.